There was once an old woodcarver named Geppetto who lived alone in a small dark cottage at the edge of a forgotten forest. Geppetto was not like other woodworkers. His carvings seemed alive. The villagers whispered that his hands worked too perfectly, that his puppets blinked when you weren't looking or shifted their heads when no one was near. Geppetto ignored the rumors. All he wanted was a child of his own. One stormy night, Geppetto carved his masterpiece. Using wood from the oldest tree in the forest, he created a puppet unlike any he'd ever made. The puppet's face was smooth and boyish, its joints articulated with precision. He named it Pinocchio. But something about the wood felt wrong. It was heavy and warm, as though it had been alive. As Geppetto worked late into the night, he heard faint whispers, low and guttural, like voices from a dream. He convinced himself it was just the wind. When the puppet was complete, Geppetto sat back and sighed. "I wish you were a real boy," he murmured. At that moment, the wind stopped. The room grew cold, and the flickering lantern dimmed to a faint glow. A voice, deep and hollow, spoke from the shadows. "Do you truly wish for the boy to live?" Geppetto turned, heart pounding. There, in the corner of the room, stood a figure cloaked in black. Its face was obscured, but its glowing eyes burned into Geppetto's soul. Terrified yet desperate, Geppetto nodded. The figure stepped forward, raising a long, gnarled finger. "I can grant your wish, but every gift comes at a price. The boy will live, but only as long as he feeds me. If he doesn't, he will wither and rot until he's nothing but splinters." Geppetto hesitated, but his longing outweighed his fear. "Yes," he whispered, "I'll do anything." The figure touched the puppet, and with a hiss, the wood began to shift. Pinocchio opened his eyes, large, dark, and empty. He smiled, but it wasn't the smile of a child. It was too wide, too knowing. The figure disappeared, leaving only the sound of faint laughter behind. At first, Geppetto was overjoyed. Pinocchio moved, spoke, and even laughed like a real boy. But soon he noticed something strange. Pinocchio didn't eat or sleep. Instead, he stared at Geppetto with unblinking eyes, smiling that same too wide smile. And then, the hunger began. Pinocchio's first victim was the neighbor's cat. Geppetto found him crouched over it in the yard, his wooden fingers stained red. "I was hungry, Papa," Pinocchio said, tilting his head. His voice was soft and sweet, but his eyes gleamed with something feral. Geppetto tried to ignore it. He buried the cat and told himself it was a phase. But it wasn't. Over the weeks, Pinocchio grew stronger, his wooden limbs becoming smoother, more lifelike, and with every transformation, the hunger grew. He started with animals, birds, rabbits, even a stray dog. But soon, animals weren't enough. One night, Geppetto woke to the sound of footsteps. He found Pinocchio in the kitchen standing over a lifeless man. It was the butcher from the village, his throat torn open. Pinocchio looked up, his mouth dripping red. "I needed more, Papa," he said, his voice still sweet. "To be real." Geppetto was horrified, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy Pinocchio. "You must stop," he begged. But Pinocchio only smiled. "If I stop, I'll die." The killings continued. Pinocchio grew more human with each victim, his wooden skin becoming flesh, his hollow eyes filling with dark pupils. But even as he became more real, something about him was wrong. His limbs were too long, his grin too wide. He moved with a jerky, unnatural speed, his laughter echoing like a child's but distorted. The villagers began to notice. People disappeared, their bodies never found. They avoided Geppetto's cottage, but the whispers grew louder. "That puppet isn't natural," they said. "He's a demon." One night Geppetto confronted Pinocchio. "You have to stop this," he cried. "You've become a monster." Pinocchio tilted his head, his smile fading. "But you wanted me to be real, Papa. This is what it takes." He stepped closer, his now flesh hand reaching out. "Do you want me to die?" Geppetto froze. He couldn't destroy his creation, even as the guilt consumed him. "No," he whispered. "I just want my son back." Pinocchio's smile returned, wider than ever. "Then, you understand I have to keep feeding." The final straw came when the villagers stormed Geppetto's cottage. They had found the remains of Pinocchio's latest victim, a child from the village, and demanded justice. But when they entered, they found chaos. The workshop was splattered with blood, splinters of wood scattered across the floor, and Geppetto, trembling, stood in the corner, clutching a rusted axe. Pinocchio stood in the center of the room, no longer resembling a puppet. His flesh was almost human now, too human. His arms and legs were unnaturally long, and his smile stretched impossibly wide across his face. His skin, though soft, still bore faint wooden grain lines, a haunting reminder of what he once was. "Papa," Pinocchio said, his voice sweet but chilling. "Why are they so angry? I'm only trying to live." Geppetto raised the axe, his hand shaking. "You have to stop this," he said, his voice cracking. "I can't let you hurt anyone else." Pinocchio tilted his head, his dark eyes narrowing. "I told you, Papa. If I stop, I'll die, and you'll lose me forever." The villagers hesitated at the doorway, unsure of what to do. None dared step closer. Pinocchio took a step toward Geppetto, his movements fluid, yet unnatural. "You wanted me to be real, didn't you? This is what it takes. You made me this way." Tears streamed down Geppetto's face as he gripped the axe tighter. He knew what Pinocchio had become, a monster, but he couldn't bring himself to swing. "There must be another way," he whispered. "Please." Pinocchio's smile faded, replaced by something colder. "There is one way," he said, his voice suddenly deep and echoing with something otherworldly. "I can stop if you give me what I need, if you give me you." Geppetto froze. The villagers gasped, retreating further into the shadows. "What do you mean?" Geppetto asked, his voice barely audible. "I need your life, Papa," Pinocchio said, his smile returning, wide and menacing. "If you give yourself to me, I'll have enough to be real forever, and no one else will need to die." Geppetto's heart pounded in his chest. He looked at the villagers, their faces pale with fear. He looked back at Pinocchio, who now loomed over him, his long fingers twitching. "You'd stop?" Geppetto asked. "You'd stop killing?" Pinocchio nodded slowly. "Forever." The room fell silent. Geppetto's hands dropped to his sides, the axe clattering to the floor. He looked into Pinocchio's hollow eyes, searching for the boy he had once dreamed of having. But there was nothing there. Just hunger. Just emptiness. "I'm sorry," Geppetto whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. He stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on Pinocchio's shoulder. "If this is what it takes, then so be it." The villagers shouted, begging him to stop, but Geppetto ignored them. He knelt before Pinocchio, tears streaming down his face. "I love you," he said, his voice breaking. "Even now." Pinocchio's grin widened and his hands closed around Geppetto. For a moment, there was silence. Then, with a sickening crack, Pinocchio's jaw unhinged, and he devoured Geppetto in one swift motion. The villagers screamed and fled, slamming the cottage door behind them. Inside, the house fell eerily quiet. Pinocchio stood in the center of the room, his body trembling. His skin rippled, his flesh glowing faintly as he transformed for the final time. But something was wrong. His movements slowed, his grin faltered. His body began to splinter, cracks spreading across his limbs. A guttural scream filled the air as the dark magic that had kept him alive unraveled. Geppetto's sacrifice hadn't strengthened him, it had destroyed him. The puppet boy collapsed to the floor, his body shattering into a pile of lifeless wood. The workshop fell still, save for the faint echo of Geppetto's final words, "I love you." The villagers returned hours later to find nothing but ashes and splinters where Pinocchio had stood. Geppetto was gone, his sacrifice erasing the monster he had created. Some say his spirit lingered, watching over the village, ensuring that nothing like Pinocchio would ever rise again. But deep in the forest where the cursed tree once stood, some claim to hear faint laughter on stormy nights, a reminder of the price of forbidden wishes.